Right, only a mere 4 years since I begun, I'm now ready to wrap up my series of Metal Gear Solid reviews. It's been quite the journey, with some incredible highs and awkward lows, but does the 5th main entry deliver a satisfying conclusion to one of the more fascinating game series out there? Even though 4 already had done? Is it a worthwhile addition in that case? Well, as per usual, this is only my verdict, so if you're sitting comfortably, let's begin my assessment. I'm sure you have noticed that I own the Definitive Experience Collection, which packs in both Ground Zeroes and the Phantom Pain, even though they were initially both released separately. And playing it in this fashion means I have very little to say about Ground Zeroes on its own. It's just the opening level of a game with credits attached. Well, full credits, because in a bizarre design choice, every mission in the Phantom Pain opens and closes with mini credits. Weird and kind of detrimental to immersion, isn't it? But back to Ground Zeroes, it was a massive Mickey take that it got released fully priced despite only being an hour-long thing. And having the rest of the game readily available to me meant I skipped all the side tasks and jumped straight into the main bulk of the experience with little thought for its prologue. Now, even though this is labelled Metal Gear Solid 5, it's more of a sequel to PSP spin-off Peace Walker, which I could play through the PS3 HD collection, but elected not to for now once I started and realised I was only playing it for the review. Maybe one day I will, but yeah, if you stick to the numbered titles, you won't really have any emotional attachment to who you're supposed to care about, as well as be that invested in the mother base which gets obliterated at the end of Ground Zeroes. But putting that aside for now, this game also follows up Snake Eater by putting us back in the shoes of Big Boss, now known as Venom Snake, who, after recovering from a coma brought on from the events I just described, teams with Ocelot to assemble an army to take down new enemy Skullface because revenge or something? I'll be honest, I can't remember. Yeah, after people complained about how story-heavy 4 was, Kojima did a complete 180 and made this the least plot-driven game in the entire series. Okay, fine, I have no issue with that, but what I find weird is how the first couple of hours set it up as the usual cinematic adventure expected from the series. There's this really lengthy linear opening mission, which is pretty tense, but afterwards, despite how cool it is the majority of cutscenes are done in one long take, I'm a real sucker for that sort of thing, there's really nothing. And both that intro and the entirety of Ground Zero spend time setting up this significantly darker tone demonstrating the horrors of war, with mass executions and a genuinely disturbing emergency surgery. But nothing really comes out of it in the end, and with how excessive it is at the start, it becomes harder to take it seriously. I couldn't help but find humour in how repetitive the whole waking up, doctor reveals something traumatic, Snake panics and you're put back to sleep shtick is. I highly recommend watching In the Littlewoods video reacting to this opening. After playing through it myself, it became that much funnier to see him react to the bizarre quirks and the outlandishness of the flaming whale.
What's with the dramatic zooming on the arse?
And I would talk about Kiefer Sutherland replacing David Hayter as the voice of Snake, but there's not much point as he acts more like Link in this game and is mostly just spoken to by the other characters. A few cast members also got replaced, except for Otacon, whose original voice doesn't really gel with the more realistic look here. Am I the only one who felt that?
It's a variable, multi-legged tank. A spin-off of Metal Gear technology.
And putting aside however good or bad the gameplay is, the vast majority of missions in this game don't really give you a reason why you're doing anything. I mean, yeah, it's usually to extract someone who will join your base, but there's no narrative urgency to anything you do. Even when the mother base is hijacked, you take the terrorists out and then it's as if nothing even happened. But even when it tries to drum up stakes like this epidemic infecting the mother base where soldiers have to isolate, well, say what you want about Kojima, but he's often ahead of the times. I just couldn't bring myself to care because I didn't feel any attachment to Mother Base or any of the mindless NPCs working there. In all honesty, once I stopped capturing footage for this video, I started skipping cutscenes out of boredom. This is easily the low point of the series when it comes to storytelling, and if you want to make the argument that the cassette tapes add further context and depth to the narrative, that doesn't count. They're an optional bonus. I love listening to the tapes in the likes of Arkham Asylum and City because they already present a fascinating world to the player with the option of expanding things further there if you want it. MGS5 makes little effort to make me care about the characters and what they're doing, so I never felt compelled to listen to any of them, particularly when you can find some 80s bangers lying about on the battlefield. Now, like I said, Kojima likely consciously made the decision to focus less on the plot and more on creating an entirely gameplay-driven experience. So as long as the story got shortchanged in favour of wonderful mechanics to play around with, then we still have ourselves a great experience. The big change up to the Metal Gear Solid formula here is placing the action in a big open world, just as Death Stranding did a few years later. And similar to Death Stranding, this doesn't work. For me, anyway. I'll concede there is an initial novelty to riding on horseback to find the base you're going to be infiltrating, the beautiful backdrops conjuring up western vibes, but after a while it started to become grating for many reasons. First of all, there's no practical reason for the map to be this big. I get the sense it's only open world because that generation of gaming was very open world obsessed to pad out the runtime. Same thing with the unnecessary online features. But there's barely anything interesting to discover here, and what the world is filled with began to drive me up a wall. Firstly, all the extra posts you may have to go past when going to the actual objective and you get caught by a guard. It's really annoying because it can mess up what you're actually supposed to do when everyone's hunting you down. Traversal is already time-consuming enough, so it becomes frustrating when you're inconvenienced by unnecessary enemies. And it's time-consuming because while you have helicopter landing zones to choose from, the game will sometimes specifically restrict you to really far away from where you need to start. And if you're already on the ground, you have to go somewhere else just to begin the mission. But what bugs me the most is that the terrain isn't ideal for the tools you have available to traverse. For as awe-inspiring as the environments are, there's far too many unclimbable cliffs which you'll be taken to by virtue of following the marker, so you have to take the longer roadway which could be littered with those extra guard posts halting you further. So by the time I'd arrive at my destination after the hassle of finding an ideal path, I'd lost patience with the game. And when the game needs you to be stealthy, that's not good. Okay, if you've seen a few of my reviews before, then you'll have likely noticed that my feelings on the story often reflect how I feel about the gameplay. And at the moment it looks like that this game will be no exception. But once we get to the main bulk of Metal Gear Solid 5's gameplay, it's really darn fun. It still has some issues which I'll address, but on the whole, my experiences were mostly very positive. I had my doubts playing Ground Zeroes. The new addition of time slowing down once you're caught left me wondering if the stealth would become too easy. However, you can turn this feature off, although I did find it became very useful against the larger bases of enemies who can also spot you from much further away now. Not having this would have made the game too difficult, I think. True, it is sometimes easier to just get spotted so you can line up the perfect headshot with the trank, but I dunno, it worked for me and it wasn't as detrimental to challenge as it was in Ground Zeroes. The number of guards will overwhelm you anyway. And for all my moaning about the huge open world, I have to admit the openness of the environment works really well with stealthing around. Surveying the scene from afar and marking enemies with these binoculars feels great, an instantly classic addition to the series which can really aid in your sneaking once you venture in. The lack of linearity also gives you the freedom to approach the missions from multiple angles and entrances. I mostly just stuck to tranquilizing the guards or outright avoiding them where I could, but I'm sure you could experiment with lots of different weapons and whatnot to spice things up. It can be a bit frustrating how certain missions necessitate using certain items like explosives or a sniper rifle, but the game won't make that known until you're in the thick of the action. Supply drops do help even if they take at least a minute to show up, but I made a complete disaster of this mission because I hadn't a clue C4 would be ideal to have, so I had to restart with what I needed. Sure, when it all falls into place, it does offer great satisfaction, but there were multiple times where I'd be running around aimlessly because of the large map or the lack of necessary resources, as I said, and it becomes agitating. Same thing with when enemies are hunting you. Why can't I pick up important files until they're no longer hunting me? All it does is lead to a few minutes where you can't really do anything and it just feels like a waste of my time. But whenever those issues aren't bothersome, the game can become quite engrossing. The main mechanics are very fun to control. I especially like the new dive into crawl mode as well as ballooning people away, and while I underestimated the usefulness of the new interrogation feature early on, I really grew to appreciate its inclusion to piece together a more specific location for your objective. And where levels no longer follow a plot-specific path, there's lots of times where you can get into unresolved situations with a sense of spontaneity that I never felt was available in the previous games. Extracting personnel or taking someone out and escaping the vicinity is exciting, no matter how often you have to do it. And when I've had difficulty with a section that wasn't down to previously mentioned issues, it can become quite exhilarating to gradually piece together the best strategy to complete the objective and fly away in the chopper victorious. Rewarding stuff. And as I say all this, I realise the lack of a complex story and the open world does make the core gameplay more enjoyable, even though I complained about them. Skullface is a non-present, so to me, there was no larger threat. It was just me as Snake, my horse, and my arsenal of weapons infiltrating a bunch of random terrorist hangouts. It's a collection of basic stealthy scenarios which is up to you to master, and the iconicness of the routine I grew to develop does become very engaging. Most of the objectives are very similar. I can only think of a small handful which stand out somewhat, but the added effect of having to think on your feet kept me in the action in a way the series hadn't done before. That wasn't meant to be a dig at the previous entries, their approach to the stealth genre still works very well. I'm just saying that 5 comes off as one of the more unique entries in that way, but I still really enjoyed it. But this approach does have its drawbacks, and even though there is less emphasis on telling an overarching plot from mission to mission, there is still the odd plot developing mission here and there which strays from the established formula, and they're less enjoyable. Some of them are, anyway. I did like the sniping duel against Quiet as a less suspenseful version of the end battle from Snake Eater, but now that I'm at the end of the series, I think the end might be my favourite boss from all the games. It's up there anyway. so I still had fun with this similar version. It's kind of funny though how Miller told me to kill Quiet at the end, so I did without realizing that'd kill her for good so she wouldn't become a prominent character in the story, skipping quite a few cutscenes along the way. I mean, if you went into the game knowing nothing, would you know she was supposed to be important later? But hey, if it means I got to watch less cutscenes, that's fine by me, and it is one of the few moments throughout the whole thing where Kojima's wit shows. As well as actually feel fun, the stupid chicken hat felt very condescending when the option to equip it shows up after you die only twice, particularly if the death was cheap. Sorry for that minor tangent, I couldn't fit it anywhere else in the script. But back to the bosses, this encounter with this literal pyromaniac is also alright too. But outside of that, the game introduces these zombie-type enemies called the Skulls, which show up on sparse occasions. I'm not a fan of them, appearing out of place in this otherwise gritty depiction of war, and where they're not used very often, they appear too overpowered and the head-on encounters against them just aren't particularly fun. The gunplay in CQC is fun to utilize when against normal guards, as well as in the multiplayer, which I probably won't stick with, but what I played was pretty fun, to give credit where credit's due. But where only being able to carry two primary and secondary weapons with you is rarely problematic, it can be very irritating against the Skulls. And typical no-cover shooting isn't that great when compared to the normal mission template. Then there's this fight against a Metal Gear, which highlights a larger issue with the game. At first I found it to be an irritating game of hide and seek where I couldn't progress until it lost me, but of course it kept finding me. Then I came back to it later on and breezed through to the chopper in no time at all. Really, once you know what you're doing, you can complete the majority of these missions quickly. It takes longer by virtue of figuring out what to do and general waiting around for a target to show up or additional traversal. So the missions will still take up a lot of time, and with 50 main missions, the game is far too long. I have grown to have this intimidation for really long games, I will admit. But even though I do like this game a fair bit, it does all bleed together with very little standout moments. It's all a middle act of something. You've had everything established and can experience what's been established, knowing a climax or rising stakes isn't imminent. And there's all this other stuff in there as well, from mother base management, which I didn't bother with, as well as side ops. The main missions are quite fulfilling enough already with their own side tasks. And why is an actual story mission initiated through the side mission menu? There's a lot to this game, but very few times does a particular moment of gameplay stand out enough to justify the absurd length. The game as it is good fun, but I'd find it to be great fun if the main campaign were reduced to 25 or so tightly designed missions and a more condensed story being told across them. There'd be more incentive to replay them outside of getting an S rank, which isn't even that hard to do, and the whole being able to beat some of them in a couple of minutes shtick might be a fun speedrunning challenge too. The side ops might seem more alluring as well. But that's just my ideal version of the game. As it is, it's still a very enjoyable collection of stealth missions, which is perhaps distant from the spirit of the rest of the series, but I don't know, this change-up was mostly a breath of fresh air for me. And in its best moments, it's some of the most fun I've had with the entire Metal Gear Solid franchise. Its basic gameplay is great, but the way everything else is put together does bring it down a bit. I'm not sure if I would prefer a tighter experience or if they outright scrapped the narrative and just had this be a game where you're sent on missions, but for what we got, I did have fun with it. I'd say it's completely inessential to the series from a story front, but if you can find it cheap, I'd recommend it solely on the basis of it having some very entertaining mechanics and missions to flex your sneaking skills. An odd note to end the series on, perhaps, but then again, this series rarely was conventional in its execution, was it?
Departing.